The external stuff that I do is just doing the thing. It's kind of going through the motions, because I'm having to always remind myself that is never going to be the ultimate source of satisfaction. The ultimate source of satisfaction is always internally generated. And I'm a bit of a purist with that. Like, I do 100% believe that if you were to go and sit on a mountain and just do the work, do the internal processing, you'd be able to get there. It's accelerated by being out in the world, because the world is the thing that pushes your buttons and locates your trigger points so that you can work with them. But it's never going to be ultimately fulfilling.
This video is sponsored by Suns. Suns are a men's healthcare brand that offer clinically proven licensed hair loss treatment for less than the cost of a coffee every day. Follow the link in the description and use the code KickoffSessions40 to avail of 40% off your first order. All right, man, let's kick off. Yusef, as I mentioned to you, someone who's highly recommended on my show, and the more I go down your stuff, I think I didn't research a guest more than I say yourself, to be honest, because there's so much information about you online, which is hilarious because you've been at this game for nearly 8 years or whatever.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been pretty crazy, man, I imagine, on your side.
So yeah, we started Propane 2008, 2009. But
that's before even Instagram got fucking big, man, or even started.
Yeah, we were lucky because we were just blogging about, protein and hypertrophy and like really kind of basic fitness terms. But it was back in the day when you could rank on page 1 of Google for terms like hypertrophy or get bigger arms and that kind of thing. So that's kind of what gave us the initial boost. Obviously, a lot has changed since then, and we've been a bit slow to change with the times, but we've been creating content in some form since then.
I think you're being a bit harsh on yourself, man, because I've seen even like your latest designs, your latest work is pretty amazing, and I want to get in contact with you for many different reasons, but I think what's really stood out to me is the various careers you've had and how you've kind of adjusted your careers, and that's very impressive. And it's been really cool to see you've continued your online business. You've obviously progressed it quite aggressively most recently, but I kind of want to go back to some of the origins as to like what your influences were. So your background, you initially went into asset management or investment banking, moved into medicine, which is abstract as fuck. So like, can you talk to me through maybe some of the biggest drivers for you doing either of those and how that kind of came about?
Sure. So there's a lot of, on paper, what looks like a lot of handbrake turns. And I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, where you start going down one line, and then before you know it, all of the supporting structures and prerequisites and things to get to that point require you to end up going down several what look like tangential rabbit holes. So when you're making a podcast, you find yourself down the rabbit hole of like, okay, this is the frame rate of this input and I need to get this microphone. And then you start to have to improve your speaking as a skill. And then you're doing research and you're collecting notes. And before you know it, you're down like a marketing rabbit hole, when the initial domino that I imagine got you into this was dissatisfaction with your job and wanting to improve yourself in the various domains of your life. So this stuff kind of happens organically. But to give you a brief background for your listeners, I was working in BlackRock, so asset manager, back in 2012, 2013. And that was really because the degree that I did was maths and business. I was like, just do the default thing, like, oh, I'm good at maths, and what do people do in careers? They do lots of business and transactions and things. So I'll do that. And every graduate scheme, as I'm sure you'll attest to, is marketed as like, oh, you'll be working in a dynamic environment with lots of fast-paced whatever and in exciting teams. And what it is, every graduate scheme is 2 monitors and Microsoft Excel, and you're just doing that from 7 a.m. till 6 p.m. every day, just dressed up in various flavors. So, or PowerPoint if you go down the marketing sales route. So you're either an Excel guy or a PowerPoint guy. So I very quickly started to catch on to the fact that this isn't what I signed up for. This was very much the default choice. Because at the age of 16, what the hell do you know? You're just following the path that you're kind of expected to follow. And looking at my boss, who was 10 years my senior, and he was pretty miserable, but he just had slightly more responsibility, marginally higher salary. You're just thinking, if I work really hard and I'm a good boy, that's where I'll end up. So it's something you better make a change sooner rather than later.
The problem with that as well is the fact that his environment and his case was so different than yours, and I think that's the issue with the graduate programs, what I felt. So working for large consulting firms, and that I remember distinctly, asking when can I be promoted. So I was like a year into the role, and a promotion was coming, and it was like a baseline promotion. They kind of do it to everyone, like 60% gets promoted, whatever, to keep you gamified. And I was like, what about the next one? And they were like, no, 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 you gotta hold on. They're like, slow down. You gotta hold down, and
Got the little
it'll come
carrot,
eventually.
just like darting that carrot away every time you get close to it.
Exactly. So the whole idea was my inputs didn't matter, but the output. I could do a good bit of work and get that easy promotion, but if I did extra bit of work, I couldn't get any more. That was the biggest issue for me, which is kind of similar to what you're talking about in there. But especially when you looked at your bosses, like they may not be the people you want to completely look up to, because a lot of them could be out of shape. They could have bad health problems, bad family problems, and they were just committing to this path because they didn't look at other alternatives. And it's a different era. I know you're a couple years older than me, but it was a different era back then, whereby just get the job, just go straight down. So for you, it was good that you were able to look at those other perspectives.
Oh man, there's so much in what you just said there. So the era thing definitely I'd like to get onto, and the following the model of our parents and just doing what they thought was the best thing for us. But there's also this thing you said about there's a floor and a ceiling. And if 60% of people get a promotion because it's just the way to keep the staff motivated, really you have to actively fuck up to not get the promotion. And yet if you work really hard and you smash it, you can pedal as hard as you want, but you're not going to accelerate the process. Now, it's weird because the incentive structure is a bit distorted in very large companies. And I remember Johnny saying something similar where, as an accountant or as an auditor, he was like, well, you're given kind of project-based work, but you're paid by the hour. So if you get through the project, your reward is that you get given more work. And so there's an incentive to work slowly, because it's not as if completing the project means you can go home early. If you finished all your work and you were really efficient and you were like, right, 2 p.m, I'm done, I've smashed it, I didn't take a lunch break, I've just bashed through it, and then you're like, I'm heading home, everyone would be like, whoa, what are you doing? It's 2 o'clock. Whereas when you're working for yourself, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because it's entirely project-based. What you do is how you're compensated. But also there's no boss looking over your shoulder and keeping you accountable. So it's a really, really interesting dynamic, and it depends on your personal discipline, your ability to set the boundaries with what you can achieve day to day, but also your temperament and your propensity to enjoy the kind of office environment where there's other people around. And I'm not slating on these kind of jobs. I think a lot of people are really good at just kind of defining the game for themselves and saying, this is what I will find satisfying and this is what I want to excel at. But for me, I'm too greedy. And I think you're the same, that I don't want to just excel in a specific marker of my career and let my body or my spiritual life or my relationships suffer as a result.
Man, what's interesting there is I think you said the word greedy. I wouldn't describe you as greedy. I would say that you are creative and you want to explore different things. And I think that's been a huge marker for you to say, fuck asset management, I'm going to go do medicine without doing science in school. Like, that's a weird exploration element that I've seen you reference Tim Ferriss. I've only seen people like Tim Ferriss think like that. Very unique ability between especially young people, because I can imagine you turning around to your parents when you got a good job in BlackRock and said, you know what, fuck this, I'm gonna go become a doctor. They'd be like, wait, what? You just did maths and business, and now you're in BlackRock, and you could be a VP in 5 years.
Yeah, so that's, I guess that's the other side of the story, that while I was doing my degree and working in BlackRock, we were running Propane. It was nowhere near profitable enough to even think about doing full time, but it was very much driven from a desire to get to the core of the physiology of metabolism and to understand that stuff, because classic sort of 20, 23-year old me, lifting weights, wanting to try and optimize it as much as possible. And so I just kind of thought, what's the logical conclusion of this? Going to be a doctor, because coaching and medicine in my mind were very similar, because it's the application of the body of data into eliciting a result in a client or in a patient. Obviously, the difference between clinical medicine and coaching is that in one, you're taking someone from a diseased state to a functional state,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe you're slowing the decline in many cases. Whereas with coaching, you're taking someone from a usually normal state to a optimal or higher performance state. But they're the same basic structure. You know, a person comes
Mm-hmm.
to you with a problem or a deficiency, and you apply the evidence base to fix it. It was probably hubris that made me think like, oh, I could have a crack at medicine, even though I've done no sciences. I managed to get into some kind of scheme where they kind of give you the A-level equivalents of science, so you can enter medicine, because a lot of medical schools require some background in science, which I didn't have. And after doing that and entering the actual course, the first term of the first year of medicine was more work and more density of data than my entire 4 year maths and business MA. It
I can
was
imagine.
so humbling. Yeah, so that's very much a sink or swim thing, and it makes you understand why they have to select through multiple grades and IQ tests and all these kind of things, because they get fined if a medical student fails, especially in the final year. The government gets fined quite a lot, so the pressure's on them to select for a high standard of academic performance. And it just forced me to grow. You know, I think being pushed through a system like a kind of meat grinder that is larger than you and makes sure that you get through it. And this is the positive side of what you said about, if the floor is raising, it's a bit like, did you ever play Sonic the Hedgehog, where
Mm-hmm.
the water rises and rises and you have to stay above the water? And then passing med school, no one cares if you got a distinction or a merit, or if you pass. You know, if you pass, you are safe, you are suitable to be a doctor out in a hospital. And so it really forces you to raise your standards.
How did you cope during that kind of first semester or quarter? Because let's say you were doing your role in Black Rock, you're doing pretty well, whatever, and then you're managing Propane, so you kind of you're getting there, you're kind of making a bit of cash, whatever, and now you've moved across. So I imagine the workload and the stress has gone through the roof. Propane has maybe had a slight dip, or you're continuing to do it. Was there ever a breaking point there?
Yeah, so propane was gaining traction by that point. By the end of my first year, my dad died. I lost
Fuck.
about 23 grand trading, which was almost risked my place at the med school. And I was
How?
and well, I stupidly bet the savings that I'd made at BlackRock to try and pay my way through med school, and I just put it all on red, basically on on Brent crude oil, and yeah, so we can we can discuss that in a second. But that was a really stupid decision because I had no backup. And propane was starting to gain traction, but not profitable enough, but very high on time cost. We were then at the point where Johnny actually quit his job in KPMG because he was kind of tired of it. He'd been working there for 3 years by that point, so he'd finished his kind of basic auditing ACA
Hmm.
qualification.
Yeah.
And then by that point, I'm like, well, I'm midway through med school. I've kind of sunk a lot of cost into this. I want to do propane full time, but there's still a few years to complete. So I finished med school, worked 2 years in the hospital, and now we're both full time propane.
Yeah, well, you got there, and it's interesting you said that because you were saying about the timeline. So I would think that there's always this kind of like lack of patience among younger people. You could even say even with me, because it's like I need this now. I need this now.
Yeah, but it was only an 8-year detour, man. Like that's no.
But man, how do you delay that gratification so much in terms of like, even the reward system of doing the medical exams? Like I know you kind of you're doing a lot of stuff where you've blown over it, and it's been kind of in the past. But honestly though, like the amount of people that would want to take a shortcut, dropping out, go do propane full time at the time where it wasn't the perfect timing.
Mm.
um how do you delay gratification to make sure you're focused and concentrated through all the shit?
I'm not immune to that at all. But as you've probably discussed on
Mm,
your podcast, that one of the big predictors of achieving something is your ability to delay gratification. And we've seen the marshmallow test where they put kids in a room and they gave them a marshmallow and they said, right, here's a marshmallow for you, nice big fluffy white marshmallow, and you can eat it now if you want to, no problem. Or if when I come back in 10 minutes, you don't eat it, I'll give you another marshmallow as well. And the kids are sat there and they film them and they're sat there like mincing over this marshmallow. Like you can see the beads of sweat dripping down there and they'll be like sniffing it. And the ones who are able to defer gratification and get the second marshmallow generally tend to map onto success in later life.
mhm,
And so yes, part of that's temperament because those kids probably haven't trained it by the age of 4 or 5. But I do think it is a malleable skill. And it's a constant thing that you have to have at the back of your mind, I think, leaning into discomfort and not trying to take the shortcuts. And I still
mhm,
do loads on a micro and macro level. And I have to catch myself taking little shortcuts and being like, oh, why did I? And it catches up with you. You spend 5 years looking for the life hack when actually, if you just did the the boring, hard, foundational basics, you would have got there in 1 year or 2 years. But no one wants to do that
mhm.
because it's not sexy.
Yeah, two things on that. First, with the marshmallow test, wasn't the other group that like ended up being like drug addicts or some shit in the end?
Oh, savage.
Well, what was it though? It was like they ended up like what am I completely wrong in saying this? Because I was saying
I,
this to
I'm
someone
not sure. I've
recently.
not I've not read the follow up in detail, but that is brutal if that's the case.
I thought that they ended up like in poor roles anyway, poor jobs, like cutting out of university or something. I could be completely wrong in this. I'll look it up afterwards. But that's just one thing around that.
I don't want to be too deterministic about it as well, though. I think like if someone has I really think the basic skill that
Mm,
before gratification, all of that is just self awareness, and the
mhm,
more of that you can build, the more you can identify your deficiencies from the outside, whatever it takes to get that external perspective, whether it's a coach, whether it's meditation, whether it's whatever it is to gain as much feedback as possible and be like, here's where I'm cock blocking myself.
mhm, mhm. You're right. You're right. With taking shortcuts, you explained there, and you're saying, if you kind of do the hard yards. I heard you speak about like outsourcing stuff. You've outsourced a lot of your cleaning or your accessory or whatever it is, your tools, or if it's accounting or whatnot. Is there is there value for doing this shit first yourself, and then you're learning about what you can't or what's better to be outsourced, and how does that kind of like operate? Because for you, I imagine when you were doing propane, doing a couple of other stuff, you need to minimize your distractions and get super super sharp with what you need to do.
It's a good question because when you outsource, a lot of people are very keen to just outsource and automate straight away, but you have to have a process to outsource. Otherwise, you're just
Mhm,
replicating a shit system on you. You're just copying and pasting a system with cracks in. So you have to do whatever it is that you're outsourcing first to recognize, okay, this is where the biggest time sinks are, or this is where I don't get much enjoyment from.
mhm,
Cooking, meal prep, that kind of thing, I get no utility or value from doing that myself, and I'm a terrible cook. So I would always prefer to just pay 100 quid a week or whatever
mhm,
for meals just handled. Other people slate me for that and they go, oh, what the hell? Cooking's so enjoyable and it's an activity for the heart and it's really social. And like, sweet. Like,
it's not
I,
for you, like.
it's not
Yeah,
for
it's
me. I, I,
yeah.
I wish it was, but and there's also I think some people have psychological hang-ups around doing this because they think it feels a bit grandiose to outsource stuff. And I remember having a chat with a registrar, so one of the senior doctors, and it was I think somehow she got onto talking, like asking me about my shirts because or like ironing in some way, and I was like, oh well, I just drop off a bag of shirts, or someone that comes to the door and they just take a big bag of shirts and I pay them £1 a shirt to iron them. And she was like, what? That's so lazy. You don't iron your own shirts. And I'm like, hang on. Do you do your own ironing? She was like, well, yeah. I'm like, what's your hourly rate as a registrar? 55, £70 an hour? Like, how long would it take you to iron 3 shirts? Like, doesn't, and she was like, well, that's not, but it's lazy.
Mhm.
I'm like, well, that's just completely irrational unless you
Mhm.
get so much enjoyment from ironing shirts, which I doubt you do. Something's amiss there. And a lot of people feel like almost that it's either lazy, they place a judgment on it, or they feel like it's too, it's putting themselves, it's making themselves seem too important to do that.
Mhm. What I would think there as well, though, is that, as I've looked at your work over years and I've seen you kind of level up, I feel it's like a natural progression to like say, okay, well, at this point now, I don't want to spend Sunday ironing shirts. Even as a doctor, you want to like, focus on the right things because, funny enough, I've had a cleaner for the last couple of years. I know you mentioned it on a
Yes.
couple of other podcasts too, and so I just moved to Singapore and I just got a new one today. It's actually pretty cheap. It's like 50 Sing, so it's like €40 a week. Okay, it's all right. It's not too bad. And even Elise was like, my girlfriend was like, what are you doing that for? What's the point? And I was like, I could not be asked working a 60, 70 hour a week that I'm doing at the moment between my job in Revolut and between my podcast, and then getting up on a Saturday and like, fixing this entire apartment. It's just not worth my time. And I learned that through yourself as well. And it's not the fact that, it's, oh, I grind harder than you, you know, I'm going to be up at like 6 a.m. working really hard. It's like, I can actually just relax. I can actually just go for a walk. I can actually just go and do things.
Yeah, that's a great point because it's not just opportunity cost and like, oh well, I could be
Yeah.
working more productively in that hour. It's also like there is an opportunity cost of just enjoying your life and spending time with your partner and
Hmm.
spending time relaxing. Like that's still valuable. And Oliver Berkman talks about this in 4,000 Weeks. Great book, really reframed the idea of time for me. And he says that the people who suffer most from that trap are people like solicitors and lawyers because they're used to billing hourly. And then when they're spending a Sunday evening with their family, they're sat thinking, fuck, I could be charging £200 an hour for this or £400 an hour. And it's like, well, yeah, but what are you actually earning the money for? It's just probably to spend
Exactly.
time with your family.
Exactly. It's having that freedom and the flexibility to do what you want. And I think that's what that concept around, how you spend your time or spend your money is actually a lot of it's kind of flawed from when we're younger. It's taking on huge debt, taking on a massive mortgage at a young age, a massive wedding, let's say, and then all of these small things that you could potentially do is like, oh, it's too discretionary. It's too much down the spectrum because you have too much things that we wanted to get done. I wanted to ask you around your perspective as a doctor and how things have adjusted. So, when you were kind of doing it, what was your thought process as to why you wanted to do it? You're kind of helping like society or whatever. So how did it develop your perspective?
The desire to go into medicine was naive and ill-informed. So I I don't regret it at all, but the idea of working in a 10,000 person company where you're kind of working on like the a really kind of minute part of derivatives trade and it's kind of very abstract. To me, my simple mind needs something where it's like I've got a person in front of me and I'm eliciting a improvement or a change
Hmm.
in them. That's how I get the satisfaction. Just because I'm not able to think any more abstractly than that. And in BlackRock and in finance, they always say, oh, the work that you do is contributing to the returns on the pension fund of the firefighter. And you're like, okay, but I can't see that firefighter here and now, so it's hard for me to make that link. So medicine did definitely fill that gap for me. And the way that I make these decisions and the way that I would encourage anyone listening to make a decision about like, am I in the right job, is look at the main domains of your life. The ones that I use are satisfaction or impact, money, freedom of time, and freedom of location. There might be others which make more sense to you, but whatever it is, pick those domains and just rank your job out of those things. There are many jobs which optimize purely for one of those things. You know, if you want to really optimize for money, you can go and become a meth, run a meth empire or something, or sell heroin. But it's going to score quite low on satisfaction and quite low on freedom of time and location because you're constantly on the run. So on the other side, you know, you can do what Juji Mufu did for a while. A guy called John Call, who's a acrobat, and obviously he's doing very well now. But he used to work a job that was like 4 hours a day, part time, and it was flexible hours. And he set up his life so that he could spend as much time as possible just doing acrobatics on the grass, doing what he enjoyed. And I really love and respect that for a different reason, because it's like he decided, I want free time and enjoyment. I don't really care about the money. I don't want work stress. That's what I want. But because he was very good at it, he managed to build an empire off the back of that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it depends what you want to optimize for. You asked about medicine and how has it changed my perspective? As I went through and working as a doctor, so 2.5 years, you do start to realize that very little of what you do day to day is diagnosing and treating a patient, which is really the core task that you should be employed for. Very high percentage of the day is running around A&E looking for one of the 6 computers that works, that doesn't have a broken keyboard with if there's a missing S or a P on the keyboard and I've got an S in my name, so I can't log into that computer, and sending a fax referral for breast cancer and trying to find where the blood sticker's printing out. And you're thinking, and so that was very frustrating for me, because I'm thinking, you know, the patient suffers with this. They're the ones who are experiencing the delays of this because of really reversible, solvable problems within the system and the infrastructure. But because the kind of people that work in the NHS are really industrious, and they'll just deal with whatever, they'll just kind of hold together the system, and there's loads of bits of duct tape everywhere, that they'll just kind of deal with it. But these problems, these leaks in the system, don't get fed up the chain. And these leaks, as you can imagine, if there's a 5-minute delay from printing a blood sticker to running around the wards trying to find which printer it's come out of this time, or trying to find a working fax machine or whatever, that adds up so much. Every referral across every hospital across the country every day, or every drug that's prescribed, if there's a little delay because you're using Windows XP, and you know what I mean? Like, these things add up so much, compared to when I come home after a 13-hour shift and then open laptop, start job number 2 with Propane, where it's a very lean operation. There's 5-6 people working on it. If there's a system that's a bit slow or that's inefficient, just change the software. So going from very lean to very bloated day to day was a weird contrast. And I appreciate it's not a simple solution with the NHS. Like, it's so intermingled and there's so many patchwork bits that it would require a colossal overhaul to shift over. But I know of doctors that will turn up, and particularly if you're working in mental health, where there's different databases for patient records for physical and mental health records, you turn up and you open your computer and you're spending 15 minutes logging into 7 different systems, and the data doesn't synchronize, and then you've got a mixture of paper notes from when they were referred from the other hospital, and it's just like all this stuff adds to so much bloat, and everyone's terrified of trying to uproot it, because you can't pause patient care while it's running live to make any fixes.
Man, it's a shit show. That's an absolute shit. That's an honestly shit show, because like, me coming from a software background, like working in Revolut, building like the most agile, flexible applications, I'm not completely unaware to this, because when I worked in one of my last firms, it was a government client, and it was a similar system as you described, like a 70s, 80s system that's has so much technical debt that you can't move, and the cost of implementation of a new platform goes from the very beginning. And sure, I know you have the NHS, but we have is it VHI, not VHI. Oh my God, HSE. So with the HSE crisis, you might see the data breach or whatever. It was one of the biggest ever, I'm pretty sure, or something. Especially within a European context, because poor data. They try to do some sort of migration from fucking Windows 96 to Windows 2000, and of course, someone was like, "I'm just going to absolutely take all this data and run away." So my parents
Oh,
get fucking calls from random numbers being like, "Oh, I'm going to like sell you this. Like, come, give me your personal details," and it's a mess, man. But the whole logic here is the fact that it's built by people who should never build in the first place. But then it's being used by people who don't kind of know any better. I laughed when you said about you come home when you work on your second job. So I have the two laptop effect too. I have a Dell, I have a Mac. Mac is for work, Dell is my own one. I
oh, what a
close one down.
contrast.
I know, man. I haven't made it yet. I close one down, I open up the other one, But I even see in those two examples like how lean you can run one company, and then how process driven, red tape, and another one can be, and it's
Mm.
I believe that you saw that opportunity because the fact that your eye was open towards propane. I feel like that was the catalyst for you to be able to see an alternative route versus Windows fucking 96.
But possibly. I mean, I think I've maybe just been spoiled by the fact that I'm using a Mac at home, and propane. We're
Mm,
very much used to like the gap from idea to implementation is very narrow when you're running your own thing. It's easy to just move fast and break things. And so, but because I feel like I was disproportionately wound up by these kind of systems and technical debt, and you'd see people around you that you're like, is this not mental? Like, are you not upset? And they're all kind of like, ah, well, it just is how it is.
get
And I
on with
remember
it.
thinking, like, am I the insane one? Am I just really intolerant? But it's I really hats off to the people who have managed to just kind of tolerate it. And you've articulated it really well about the technical debt there. Luckily, there are some smart people pushing for improvements. I don't know how, I'm neither optimistic or pessimistic about it. I guess we've just got to see what happens with it. But there's a guy called Kevin Monk who works in health tech, and his thing that he pushes is public money, public code. And you're like, oh yeah, that's makes a lot of sense. That if you were to open source at least the basic systems that databases are run off, and then rather than this kind of everyone's got a proprietary system that they're all tendering for, and they
Hmm.
don't communicate with each other, and if you have this and you test run it in countries that haven't got the infrastructure, and then build on it, and it's open sourced, then you really open up and this is probably one of the big applications of blockchain technology as well for people much smarter than me.
Hmm.
So I'm glad that there are people thinking about this and pushing for improvements. But I just think large organizations are very resistant to even small improvements. And that's where I think there's going to be a hitch point,
Hmm.
because I spoke to a guy called Josh Case, Australian junior doctor, who was working a surgical job. He recognized that every morning he has to turn up half an hour early because he has to manually write data from the theatre list and type it into the ward list, and that was
Hmm.
on like Microsoft Word or whatever. And so you go into the theatre list and you type, okay, patient name, date of birth, site of operation, procedure, patient number. You do that for every patient every day, turning up half an hour early. And he was like, well, if I just learned a code and write a script that collects that data, it will obviously improve patient safety by minimizing the number of human errors and typing left breast rather than right breast or whatever.
Fuck, man.
And it obviously saves doctors time, saves bandwidth. Bandwidth is a massive one. I think one of the reasons that senior doctors get better and better is because they're not dealing with all the kind of daily admin. They're able to look at things with a higher view and use more of their brain for diagnostic ability. But anyway, he wrote this piece of script, went back and forth with IT about implementing it, made a business case for it, said that this would, based on the hourly calculations, it would save the hospital about 400K a year in man hours. And it took 8 months of going back and forth with IT and red tape to get it implemented. And he was met with a lot of resistance. And eventually he was like, do you know what? I'm quitting. I'm going to go and code full time, because that's where he's like, if I'm trying to come up with a solution and it's being blocked at every avenue,
Hmm.
it feels like they don't really want to improve, even for something so simple like that. So
Man, yeah, I'm delighted to hear he ran off to do his own fucking thing. Firstly, because that even just frustrated me, the concept of it. And what's very similar here to what you kind of understand too is That was the problem with banks in 2014 and previous years,
Oh,
because they
so
were
much
all
regulatory red tape, isn't there?
exactly, but they were so embedded in older technology that they were resistant to change. And then what happened? Fintech started kicking off 2015. You had Revolut,
Mm.
you had Monzo, you had Circle, all these other companies. And then I remember being in London at conferences 2017, 2018, all the big banks saying, fintech is just a phase, it's just going to phase off, it's going to be the end of it. But the
It's the
difference between
curmudgeons of the industry being like, oh no, this newfangled nonsense. We stick with good old fashioned banking and checkbooks.
exactly
And yeah.
the difference between this and medical, though, is the fact that for average users on the street, you can move your retail banking from, let's say, HSBC to Revolut, okay? But and so these companies were able to accelerate and take that kind of like curved approach and take customer acquisition. So it's kind of like similarities, but where the difference is the fact that our medical records are going to be held under a hospital. So it's not like
Mm.
you can create a different hospital. So so as we're discussing here, it sounds to me that the medical problem statement is not solved because transferring the data is the biggest. The integrity of the data is probably the most valuable here. Whereas in fintech, you could go from the start up and build a new fucking ecosystem, which is what they've done. But I guarantee you, we'll look back in this man in 5, 10 years, and someone will have cracked that process, being able to do some sort of medical data conservation, made able to preserve it and move it. I don't know.
I really hope so. It might need just starting again. And, you've got me on my hobby horse with this, Darren, so I will shut up about it. But we've got the idea of we've always done it this way. That is not an adequate excuse for a broken process. It's a
Hmm.
completely backward style of thinking. And I'm not blaming anyone. The people in NHS, what's it called? NHS digital, and the people that work in IT, that they've got a thankless job. Like, they're working really hard, but they're just victims to the system. And obviously the clinicians are the smartest, most competent, driven, industrious people that I've ever met. Like, I've been so inspired by the people around me, and I just feel like they're eons more smart and competent than I am. And again, that's part of the thing of like, it raises the standard of performance when you work with
Hmm.
those people. And it's heartbreaking to see them wrestling with basic technology and, abusing Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Word for things that it's not designed for.
Hmm. Of course, man. And you hit the nail on the head earlier. You said it's the bandwidth. The senior doctor dudes, they're always way better because they're. th- This is what's interesting. Their focus is not improving the tech or even thinking about it. They're just like trying to get on with it. Even in the most agile startups in the world, the guys who are in ops and compliance and let's say finance, they're not even thinking about the tech. It's only the guys that are in product that are like, it's not even the engineers, man. The engineers aren't even thinking about efficiency. It could be just the guys who are working on the front end. The back end guys are just trying to optimize for maybe performance. But this is what I'm trying to say is that it gets so narrow in terms of like who actually can make the change. It is generally just a handful of people.
And that's scary if the culture and the mindset of those linchpin people is doing the bare minimum. Because then, like, it doesn't matter how good your engineers are, it doesn't matter how good your clinicians are,
Mhm.
you're kind of stuck. And you're
Definitely.
right, like the software engineers, like, they're the smart people actually doing the thing. But as you say, like, with such a large operation, their remit is very narrow, and it's just like, well, I've just got to fix this thing that the product manager has said
Yeah, exactly. And
needs doing.
funny enough, I didn't take up this opportunity, but I was asked to work on a government project recently, just like a freelance thing, but it was with a utilities company, and it was going into like literally speak with their product managers and product owners to change that transformational only from a mindset perspective, like literally like what they're trying to achieve, because a lot of them were just keeping the lights on, going through the
Mm.
motions, and just focused on how it was done versus how it is done. Because
Do
in
you
in the
think that's
startup
something
world,
that's coachable, or do you think they'd have to, like? Do you think it's just a case of get rid of them and find some people who have got the right head on their
it's
shoulders?
it's the company's approach. So I think that all products that have a customer base should be product led by the heads of the product. So let's say me and you have, let's give an example. Let's say we own Instagram. Okay, me as a product manager, I own the homepage. You own the profile page. it should be me and you who are deciding all of these, or sure, putting forward the business cases, the all the use cases, and all the user stories, and all the different parameters are in there that will drive revenue, engagement, monthly active users, retention, and all that kind of stuff. It should come from these people. They should be like below the directors, and they should be the champions of the product. It should not come from 80-year-olds above who are like, well, Twitter has been doing it like this, and also Snapchat is on it like this. That's not the people you need. You need just people that are just like, and again, the huge pressure comes on the product managers then to have these cutthroat KPIs that are continuously incrementally improving. That's that's how these that's how the likes of Alibaba, Robinhood, even how all those are companies were built at the prime, is by having just razor sharp product managers.
Right, interesting. So it's about the incentive structure and rewarding versus punishing innovation.
Exactly, because again, you're chasing these types of companies, and probably similar even to yourself, all type of smaller companies, especially on the tech side, are chasing customer acquisition and customer retention. So acquisition is tough, retention is even more difficult. So the churn element you want to keep obviously incredibly low, and by having that kind of like a broader incentive for that, it's much more conducive to results versus when you compare it to the government example. Well, sure, if you go to the hospital, you got to pick our system and you're going to be thrown into it. So
Mm,
it's a huge transformational thing, and I think possibly in the kind of public sector, you'd never get there because it's not incentivized enough. If someone in fintech can make an extra 50K a year, they're definitely going to do it.
yeah, it's so interesting to see the parallels and where things are lacking. I'm even trying to like renew your council tax bill on your local council website or whatever, and you're like, oh, who designed this? But yeah, I mean, you asked me about my my mindset changes as a doctor, and I just couldn't resist just getting on my hobby horse and ranting about health tech for 20 minutes. So I apologize.
You're all right, man. Don't worry. We can go off in multiple different ways. I'm the exact same because I've seen that example. I want to discuss maybe around the compensation element. So I feel like that when you were working in BlackRock, you were on a good path to make like a shitload of money. And then when you went back to do medicine, of course, you're making like fuck all. And then when you're a junior doctor, you're making pretty much nothing as well. But
Mm.
as you've kind of adjusted, how do you think about kind of your earning potential? Like, is that a high criteria as part of the what you were discussing earlier? Is that something you kind of strive to maximize?
It's important. So as a doctor, I was earning 27K a year, so about between 1,400 and 1,800 a month.
Man, that's ridiculous.
With
That's
it with Yeah,
that's
and in fact,
ridiculous.
1,400 to 2,000. There were some months that were a bit higher, but yeah, like for the number of hours, it didn't feel worth it, and I think that's the key. Like it's how you frame earning 2,000 a month, or well, even 1,800, 1,700 a month for certain jobs. You'd be like, oh, this is sweet, but it's what do you give up for that, and what's the cost on your body doing night shifts? That I don't think there's an amount that you could pay me to
Mhm.
do consistent night shifts anymore. It's literally shorten your life. Now, yes, someone has to cover that, and a lot of people just get on with it and they don't complain. It's probably again being spoiled by doing my own thing. Have running propane. So here's an example, and you might have heard me mention this on with Colin, but I remember doing a fecal disimpaction at 2 a.m. So scooping poo out of someone's bum who was constipated. And I'm sat there like I'm not great with poo as well, so I was like hiding the wretches behind my mask, and sat there thinking it's 2 a.m. This should be a surgical job, but here I am because it all rolls downhill. Shit rolls downhill, and thinking this is about £7 an hour effective hourly rate once you account for work-related costs and extra hours and obviously study and all that stuff. And then I step out of the door after washing my hands, taking my gloves off, and I got a Stripe notification on my phone within about 2 minutes, and it was for $7.99, and that was for an ebook that I wrote 4 years prior. It was a training program, and it was just the universe just going like, this is the difference. Like £7, £7, but one is earned through leverage and through the power of work that you do once and then it continues to repay, and the other is
Hmm.
directly exchanging time for money. So that experiencing that and seeing that you can create a digital product and that sells multiple times over, the ability to copy and paste yourself is not something you can do in a hospital. So having a taste of that is really important, and it's maybe not one or the other. There's certainly value in having a consistent, secure job where you do exchange time for money, as long as you can do something with that capital, recycle that capital in some way, and generate other sources of income where you are duplicating your work
Hmm.
or replicating yourself in ways with the internet.
Yeah, I honestly believe, man, that a lot of people do not understand the power of the internet, like the literal limitless capabilities of the internet. Like people think that, like, oh, like, there's the fitness guys, there's over here, there's the other entrepreneurs, but like that in itself is hugely inspiring. Like I love that kind of stuff, because how would describe you picking shit out of someone's ass and the ebook is about fighting the right battles. And Simon Ree, who was on my show last week, he said this to me years ago. He was like, you know, young guy, you can go do whatever you want. But you got to make sure that you're fighting the right battle, because you can be in a big company like BlackRock, you can work your balls off, and you'll be exhausted at the end of it and see very little return. Whereas for you, you put that time into, you understood, physiology, you understood macros, you understand all this, you put into an ebook, and it had that limitless potential. Now, overall, it may not have sold that much money, that's irrelevant, but you kind of focus on that, and now you've moved your attention across to it. I feel like that people get very entrenched in their thoughts, such that they're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, perfect examples, to be honest, and then they don't see the other alternative. But it's by messing with the internet, literally messing with it, just like recording content for 14 years, or writing ebooks that may be out of date at this stage. That gave you the kind of inspiration to go and do it. And that to me is amazing. I know you're not a big guy on LinkedIn, but if I recommend you to ever follow someone's content, is a guy called Justin Welch, who walked away from he was a managing director of a venture capitalist firm, right? He was probably on like fucking 500K a year. He's from San Francisco, whatever. And ever since, he's been building just solo businesses. He optimizes for he optimizes for doing what he wants, when he wants, with who he wants. That's like his
Mm.
thesis. And he's created, several, and this guy is no zero bullshit now. He really is zero bullshit. He's created he's still like an advisor to startups, so that's the time exchange. But then he has loads of actual digital products. He has lots of LinkedIn courses. He has a paid newsletter of like 50,000 people. Um, it's amazing. His idea is to get to 5 million in yearly reoccurring revenue, and he's on the way. But I think that speaks a lot to what you were doing, the extremities of how difficult it can be, and then the opportunity that lies elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's a key point, the doing what you want when you want. So Ali Abdal, similar situation to me. He quit medicine. He's basically written it off. Like he's given up his registration and so on. I've not written it off entirely, but he said nothing is fun when you're doing it full time, and that's very true. That actually, the from the impact and satisfaction perspective of being a doctor, let's ignore the money and all the other stuff. You don't get linearly more satisfaction doing a 30-hour clinical or a 70-hour clinical work week compared to a 30-hour one. If anything, by the time you're at hours number 70, 80, you get the care fatigue and you start to resent being there and you struggle to maintain that level of empathy for the patients. So when you have the choice of how much you want to work, and that's why that if you look at the numbers of junior doctors that are going direct into specialty training nowadays, morale is dropping and dropping because salaries have dropped both in real terms and in nominal terms. And so the numbers of people that are finishing the stage that I was at, pre-specialty training, and just taking several years to locum and to go and do other things, or just leaving the profession entirely, is rising. So I'm not the only one. And I don't know whether part of that's work conditions and part of that is generational and people starting to see that, oh, actually, there are several opportunities available for someone with my level of skill set and energy and education and willingness to do the hard stuff or whatever. So there's many changes from our parents' perspective, which I guess you were alluding to with like, and my dad was Egyptian classic, like you must become doctor or engineer or lawyer, and that, um, and so like that's he didn't actually push me to go into medicine, but I think that's because by the end of his career, he was kind of like, well, if you, it's got its pros and cons. If you want to do it, do it, but that's where it is.
Yeah, man. Like, what would you? Let's say hypothetical. You have a child in a couple of years, and he grows up. From doing what you've done, what would you advise him to do?
Take your time with making a decision, and I'd be very careful not to impose my value system on them. But I think there is a massive lag. I'm sure you would agree in terms of the value system that the educational system pushes on kids and the range of options that it tells them is maybe 20 years behind what the true opportunities are for a 16-year-old kid. And I am blown away nowadays. I don't think I'm anywhere near wise enough to father a child, and I don't think I would do a very good job of it because it's a completely different world. Khalid, what was his name? He wrote The Prophet. Khalil Gibran. So he had this imagery of, as a parent, you are the bow and your child is the arrow, and your job is to cast them into a world that you'll never be able to reach. And I think we're seeing that with younger generations, that you're seeing 16-year-olds who are just so smart and aware and smashing it, and they're just operating on a different level because I guess the rate of information being thrown at them is so much higher than we were used to. And there's a lot more challenges that they're dealing with. We're in a business mastermind where there's a 14-year-old who's making, I think, 100K a month. And it's just like, man, this is so far beyond us at 14, in the park with Lamborghinis and and just kind of messing about. So I'm not sure that I'd have much wisdom in terms of keeping up to date with it. I have to just do my best.
You're dead right, because it's the entrenched thoughts that were there in the 90s and the 2000s for people that are like 20 years old now, or sorry, that were 20 years old at the time, became outdated so quickly. Because like you can, like, I genuinely, as you said there with the 14-year-old, I've seen a 16, 18-year-olds who are like, have TikTok ad agencies, and they're like fucking killing it because they understand the market, man. They understand
Yeah.
the 16, 17-year-olds who are like putting dance videos on, and then some guy that's entrepreneurial, he's doing some ads, he's running some ads, and they're killing it for companies, So like that opportunity just arose 6 to 12 months ago. He's a founder, he's running an agency, it's a platform that's hot, and that's why it's going to come in, and the cycle will repeat. And I think it's interesting because like you find, like, that person may have never been happier. Like, he's obviously intelligent at that level, but he may never got happiness through the traditional stuff, the doctors, the bankers, and whatnot. It's quite strange, it's a different era, and that's quite, you mentioned a lot about satisfaction as well, because I think satisfaction is something that, I don't know, I think like males, probably because actually I saw something that was funny. I always laugh at this. It's like, um women go to therapy, males start a podcast. And it's so true, because I think up until like 15 years ago, like, guys just kind of got on with it. They just did roles, they just kind of got on with it. But now there's way more of an emphasis on like satisfaction, fulfillment. And a biggest influence for me was Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. So like, what do you think brings you the most fulfillment after all these experiences?
None of the external stuff does. The external stuff that I do is just doing the thing. It's kind of going through the motions because I'm having to always remind myself that is never going to be the ultimate source of satisfaction. The ultimate source of satisfaction is always internally generated. And I'm a bit of a purist with that. Like, I do 100% believe that if you were to go and sit on a mountain and just do the work, do the internal processing, you'd be able to get there. It's accelerated by being out in the world, because the world is the thing that pushes your buttons and locates your trigger points so that you can work with them. But it's never going to be ultimately fulfilling. And, you can look at that in terms of happiness rates plotted against wealth curves. And, people always, it's the classic thing of like, oh, when I do this, then I'll be happy. Or when I'm rich, or when I'm famous, or when I'm whatever. And people get there and they go, oh, I'm still got this generally kind of gnawing sense of dissatisfaction because it's internal. It's a part of the firmware of the human mind. And luckily you can update the firmware, you can update the operating system. There's broken parts of it, but that's always going to have to be the thing. And I don't know if it's conscious or unconscious, but it seems like generationally people are starting to recognize that having a job for the recognition of others isn't really worthwhile because you're the one that has to go and live that life. You have to go and deal with the consequences. Same with like marrying the person who you think is a good flex for other, for signaling, but you have to go home to them every night and deal with their bullshit. So it's you do have to look at like your internal state, and I think managing that means that then the external environment works out a lot better. And if you want to go full woo-woo about it, the state of your consciousness is reflected in your outer reality. And so if you want to hold that belief, or if you want to take that for testing, or if you think I'm just chatting lyrics, there's no disadvantage to improving the state of your consciousness.
Yeah, it's weird because I think for so long we've been so taught into, the acquisition of stuff, the acquisition of wealth, homes, security. Maybe there's a tie back to even Maslow's hierarchy of needs there, where it's like we are secure financially by working in a good role and we've got a good house above us and whatnot. And I think after a while we've kind of got to the stage whereby we've been trying to show this externally. It's exasperated by things like social media, where it's like you can show the Lambos and whatnot. But it's kind of like it doesn't really get there. And I think what's interesting here is that, when you're younger, there's always that emphasis on, I want to start this, I want to start that, and then I'll be happy, whatever. But what I always say to people recently is that like I'm living in it. Like as in the stuff that I wanted to do, I'm literally living it at the moment. It's not optimized. I'm not making 30K months, but I'm getting there. I'm recording good podcasts with you. It's a high production. It's a lot of fun. I'm doing a lot of other stuff on the side, and I'm moving there. Is everything optimized? Probably not. Will it ever be? Probably not. So I think I've come to that realization that I'm in there. I'm in that kind of
That's
where
a
I want to
great
go to.
attitude, because if you hinge your happiness on becoming Joe Rogan, then you're just unhappy until you get to that elite stage. And then it's like, well, and then you get there and you go, oh, it feels a little bit empty. What's next? You have to go and
It's always the
become,
case though.
yeah. And you see this playing out with people who are very power hungry, and they always seeking some kind of the next fix of status and power and money and so on. And that's exhausting to chase because everyone's running after that.
I had that thought as well at the weekend. So I know that you've done a lot of work with Chris Williamson, great dude. The guy's been killing it, and he showed up on
He's
Joe
been
Rogan the
smashing
other
it.
day. And I didn't realize, you know what? I didn't realize that all the life hack videos were with you and Johnny, because I saw
Yeah.
them for so long, but I didn't realize it until I went back through them, and I was like, it was
Yeah,
like,
I recognize that guy.
yeah, and I was like, I was like, oh my god. Anyway, because I remember seeing all the photos, like the kind of thumbnails he did, and I was like, wait. Anyway, so at the weekend, it was a important inflection for me because, like, he's a very ordinary dude. He's from Newcastle. I work very hard and stuff like this. And when I saw him rock up on Joe Rogan, I text Colin about it, and I was like, fair fucks to the dude. He's worked his balls off. He's interesting. He's creative. He's obviously good with people, like on a social side and stuff like this. He's got himself in some great circles. Absolutely fair fucks to the dude. You know why? Because none of this is a zero sum game. You know, he didn't have to take downloads from someone else to appear on Joe Rogan. He just did his own thing. And I think there's this weird competitiveness that we're seeing with a lot of young people, a lot of people, is that, oh, like the best. I need to be the best at this. And the fact that it's not a zero sum game, that there's space for everyone. There's space for you to excel. There's space for me to excel. There's space for you to do 10K a month. There's space for me to do 10K a month. We don't need to pull from each other. This is the issue. And I think that is something that is just not discussed at all.
Yeah, this kind of scarcity mindset. I mean, we saw it 20 years ago with, oh, they're coming into this country and taking our jobs, and it's the same thing. And if Chris and Joe Rogan, either of them had scarcity mindset, they would have been like, oh, well, he's a competitor. He's also a podcast host. So I couldn't have him on my podcast because then he'll steal, but they're both in the situation of like, look, we're all creating together. We're all friends and there's enough to go around for everyone.
And we're all
Whether or
trying it out,
not,
you know?
yeah,
We're all just trying at this game, you know? No one knows it figured out, you know?
exactly. And I think Sam Harris talks about this where he's like, even if that assumption isn't true, there's an advantage to having a kind of positive bias with the way that you perceive the world, with putting on like mildly rose tinted specs, because that's going to impact unconsciously how you come across, the little micro signals, all that stuff, and the vibe that you give out, and all that
Mhm.
stuff. And I'm talking in terms of vibe and consciousness and frequency and all these kind of things, but really like what those things are just shorthand for the synthesis of information that your unconscious kind of reptilian brain is picking up from a person of I like this
Mm.
person, I trust this person, or I don't. And that's just from how stuff that is beyond your control, isn't it? If your internal state is genuinely loving and giving, then it's much easier than trying to micromanage all the little parts of how you interact with the world.
Mhm. And as you mentioned earlier, you're saying, is that a learned behavior? I feel that like you can learn to try to be more inclusive about those ideas and less kind of jealous and stop yourself in those moments. Because he actually spoke about this. I actually watched a full 3.5 hours. I studied it pretty closely because Chris is someone that I don't know. I'm not gonna pretend like I know him in any way. I just see a lot of his work and it's very like interesting to analyze as a
Mm,
podcaster because the production is so high, the engagement's so high. There's loads of things that you can learn from what he's done. It's just like he just kind of killed it, and it's obvious to see why when you're watching it from like a abstracted level. But if you study, I like to study like podcasters, something I do a lot. And I was looking at it and I was like, he speaks about jealousy actually in it. It was very good. He was saying that there's no benefit for anyone to being jealous. It's obviously
mm,
goes back to an element of narcissism. I'm gonna butcher this, but he was saying there's an element of narcissism whereby you are so insecure that you are narcissistic to the point whereby you want that acceptance from others, and if you don't get it, that's when you're going to become even more resentful.
mm,
Kind of butchered that kind of example of it, but I thought it was very interesting because I was like, look, the guy's done amazing. He deserves all the credit for it. There's going to be many other people to follow. Hopefully, the likes of Colin, myself, yourself, will eventually move up towards there. It could take another 14 years, but it's a nicer way to look at it because bringing it all the way back from the very beginning. When the promotions come around, sure, only a couple of us get promotions, and there's
mm.
always this stabbing and resentfulness, and it's a strange dynamic.
You mentioned the Lambos and people like influencer type people creating a highlight reel and making it look like they're doing really well. Are you starting to see the cracks with this? Because I wonder whether people are gradually starting to kind of see through the net of particularly the kind of influencer type people. I guess that's the ones that I'm most aware of. That actually, like, because maybe 5 years ago, I used to unconsciously associate like a large following with like almost someone's value as a human being. I didn't want to, consciously, I was like, no, come on, that's ridiculous. It's just lines on a database. But it felt that way. Whereas now I think you've seen enough of the way that the system can be gamed. And a lot of the Instagram reality, I don't know if you've seen that. There's a subreddit where they show photos of people who have taken an Instagram photo and then they show another photo of like behind the scenes. And it's always completely mismatched. And you're like, oh, really? What they've done is they've created a photo set and it's just to get that one specific angle to make it look like they're doing really well. And I just wonder whether you think people are starting to see through the cracks and not drinking the Kool-Aid anymore.
I think that life is so multifactorial that there's so many different variables to determine like a successful life or even like a happy life that when someone does reach the accolades of 200k or 400k or 600k or a million and they're financially sound for good at that point, that new variables pop up so that they could be, you know, they could be really miserable. A great example of that, of someone who's kind of got to that kind of stage, is like when you see like kind of relationships crumble. people that have got really successful and things have fallen apart or whatnot, because I think that other things come in and actually like influence those decisions. And I'll give you another good example as well, so people kind of get to the top levels. I heard this from that podcast as well. It was kind of like Tiger Woods, the fact that when he was younger, he was this like absolute superstar. He went through so much pain. Apparently went through loads of like racial abuse, loads of physical abuse and whatnot, and emotional abuse to get to where he got to. And then when he got to where whatever it was, like 10 PGA tours or whatnot, people thought that that is the absolute, you know, epitome of top class performance, and he got all the reward and whatever. And then you fast forward a couple of years, and his ex-wife is chasing him down the driveway with a golf club. So that's obviously like someone who's actually made it. But there's a whole bulk of other people who are pretending to make it, that are in this high level of followers or whatnot, and then they end up even doing like other things, which is pretty crazy to think of, that they have to go off and do something completely new because what they were pursuing for so long has pretty much borne no return in terms of passion, purpose, and fulfillment.
Because they recognize the emptiness in signaling to people who they don't know how well they are doing, or how well they want to look like they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Because what they're getting in return is nothing substantial. I think that, and we always joke with my best mates about like the kind of the boohoo contract. It's like, you see the big boys with their boohoo contracts, and it's like, oh, they've made it. They're down the front of these covers and whatnot. But when you get to that point, you're just someone with boohoo clothing. You haven't actually. There's nothing like material difference, and this is where it goes back to your actual contribution to society. There's a guy coming on my podcast called Zenon Capron, I think his name is, a US guy, pretty soon. He's based in Singapore, like super successful dude, like really, really well acclaimed like writer, and he's a consultant for the biggest startups in fintech. And he mentioned to me recently, he was like, you can make a load of fucking money here, man. You can do a load of good successes. You can be the head of this department, head of that department. But fundamentally, a lot of it will really boil down to your contribution towards like your family and your overall like your impact you think you're having on the world personally. Beyond the title and whatnot. He was like, you'll see persons here that are head of this and head of that. And honestly, man, he was like, I can tell you that a lot of it doesn't even matter.
A lot of people don't want to believe that stuff until they go and do it, and then they go, oh, actually, yeah, they were kind of right. But yeah, obviously, I know you talked a while ago about the curve of happiness and income up to a certain point. It increases in income up to a certain point, improves happiness, and then beyond that it doesn't. But to this title thing, or this role thing, or being on the front cover of or whatever, like really that's stories and labels that they're not tangible. And the thing that is tangible to your daily happiness is going to be sleeping on a comfortable mattress and having good food and spending time with close friends and turning up and doing some kind of work that you feel like has a purpose and brings other people joy, and having a healthy body and feeling good in your body, like the really simple basic stuff. But again, the basics aren't sexy.
Man, the basics for pretty much anything aren't sexy. Even like getting work done and trying to focus on things. And you mentioned something really good about it. Even your man Dan Go.
Yeah.
So his whole focus is like entrepreneurs and high successful people, but their fitness around it. And he was like, if you're doing something today that's really positive for your effect for your body, and if you stick at it for a couple of months and you stick at it for 4 years, imagine where you could be. Health, your overall benefits, your food, your diet, your children. And that's what I look around, man, because when we were discussing earlier about when you were in HSC, and I was saying that, around people that you do, or sorry, in BlackRock, you don't necessarily want to be essentially. I remember walking into, so I did my internship in State Street. They're like another version of an asset manager. And, Canary Wharf is, I really bought into a lot of this stuff. And to be honest, to a degree, I still kind of do, in terms of like, I love being in a city when I'm submersed by really intelligent people. Environment design is very important to me because I feel like that I work harder in those areas. But anyway, so I get to Canary Wharf. It's obviously unbelievable. It's all JPM, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, whatever. I walk into the State Street office, go onto the floor, And I remember 8 a.m. looking down and seeing the floor packed with people. And all these people, I was an intern, these people would range from, let's say, 75, 80,000 pound all the way up to 250K easily, right? If not more. Every one of them, or the majority of them, were out of shape, were super pale, like didn't have that kind of complexion of like under like sun and light exposure, and looked broadly unhealthy, like really, really unhealthy. And it was at that exact moment that I was like, fuck me, I am never going to be at this level of healthiness. Not saying I'm superior in any way, but it was like that is such a health risk to be head down, eating at your desk, not getting up, 6, 7 o'clock at night, um,
You're just not
eating
willing to
again.
pay the price.
Exactly. But it's gonna come. That price is going to come though eventually, and you will be in that scenario. And I
Mm.
remember just thinking like, oh my God, like, and I remember that summer was actually one of the best summers I've ever actually got in shape. And since then I've tried to maintain that consistency, the 6 days a week or 5 days a week or whatnot.
It's there's someone who I studied with a while back who used to get really good grades, but the rest of her life was pretty awful. Like she she was working. She was a dental nurse, and she had her boss was abusive to her, and she had a horrendous family life. And I think her dad was an alcoholic and died, and she was supporting her mum who was unwell, and like really quite like a lot of bad stuff going on in her life. And her life raft was focusing on her work and getting good grades, and she was really good at that. And I remember this other girl in the class was like, "Oh, I'm so jealous of her, of Claire." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" She was like, "Oh, well, she always gets good grades." I'm like, "Would you give up your like stately home in Berkshire and your like all of this other like intact family life and all these other kind of blessings that you've got for an extra 10-15% on your grades? Like, you can't just transplant one thing. You've got to take the whole package."
Yeah, man. And I've made those sacrifices too. I've tried to make those sacrifices and it was too difficult. It's like the marginal return you get for it is so minimal. There's not that same kind of impact, I would say. How has your purpose changed now as a result? Like where do you see that focus now?
The thing that gives me the most joy personally is just freedom of time out of those variables, the four currencies that I mentioned. But I think you also said about generating intrinsic focus and enjoying the process. And I think although it's kind of glib sounding, it's sort of true, because then you've unhooked this destination that may not come from your happiness. You're not then hinging everything on achieving a particular point in the future. So that's what brings me the most joy. And then obviously being able to train and to move and to enjoy that aspect of it too. Health is one of those things that you only really appreciate when you're ill. And then for a few weeks when you're better, you're like, oh, brilliant. And then it just blends into the background again, and your body just becomes this kind of vessel that you're doing other things through. But I think, yeah, for me recently, there's the thing that I've been putting a lot of attention to has been, how can I do the spring cleaning on my internal processes? So I call it meditation, but I guess that covers anything to do with mind, body, spirit, any of the internal work, any of the work with your body, your muscular body, your emotional body, because I think those two things are linked as well. I went to a stretching workshop in London with Kit Lachlan a couple of years ago, and it was just 2 days of stretching from head to toe. And in the hip stretches, there were people bursting into tears. There were people going through kind of unhooking like these emotional furballs. And it's really interesting to experience that firsthand, that actually sources of muscular tension are blockages. They're places that emotion kind of stagnates and gets caught up in. So that I've been seeing a psychotherapist as well. I think these things are, there's so much available to us now, and it makes sense to dive in.
Yeah, man, that's crazy. What's so funny there you said about the hip kind of like placement of like emotion is that my girlfriend's actually a yoga instructor, and she
Mm,
always speaks about these things, and like
yeah.
some of it, like, you know, she's done a lot of like research in yoga, she does a lot of work in it, and then half the time I'm like, what the hell, you know what I mean? It's so crazy that there's this element to it. And as you said there about like a psychotherapist, I actually went to see a therapist for quite some time because of the fact that I was working so much, you know, stressful roles, and I was trying to grow things, and having that different perspective was really, really, really important to kind of to bring out the best in me, you know, that kind of way, to bring
Mm,
out the most or the best opportunity. But one thing that really stands out there is the fact that you're so open to these ideas. You know, you're so open to exploring. Do you, you know, deliberately say to yourself you want to go and try new things and you want to push yourself more versus just indexing and say, you know what, it's going to be a PT. You're always looking at, you know, extra things you can add in to improve yourself.
yeah, probably to a fault. Because I think, and that's why I'm very grateful to be partnered with Johnny at Propane, because he's very essentialist and he's very much able to keep the main thing, and focus on the North Star. And you know, we I feel like we kind of counterbalance each other in that way. Um, I mean, we're probably more similar than different, but certainly in I've got to be careful personally of shiny object syndrome, and Johnny's got to be careful of getting too kind of ground down on one thing. And so this is like the different styles of meditation. This is an analogy. This is not. So there's a phenomenon where if you do too much samatha meditation, which is like concentration focus on, let's say, the tip of your nose, that people develop stone Buddha syndrome, where they become hyper still and hyper focused, and they lose the peripheral vision. And then if you do too much vipassana meditation, which is the open focus floodlight style, then you become almost like overstimulated and a bit like someone on a low dose of LSD. And so the goal is to integrate the two. But yeah, you were saying that it's interesting about your girlfriend being a yoga instructor and seeing these things firsthand, for sure. One of the things that you mentioned about the stigma of something like psychotherapy is there's an assumption that to do it you have to be broken or traumatized in some way, and that
Absolutely, yeah.
stops people from doing it. And then they just go, oh, like, I'm just going to ignore my human condition and pretend that it doesn't exist, because that's for those people, and I'm not one of them. And actually, you can see the way that psychotherapy has been branded, is that people are starting to call it executive coaching, or something that sounds a bit more palatable to the kind of corporate performance world, but it's the same stuff.
It's always the same stuff, man, and that's what's so funny is that when you go back to any type of coaching, like especially like mental kind of like transformations you're trying to do, it's some of the basics you're really, really focusing on. And I imagine that a lot of those basics would be brought out through therapy, people sitting down and having the same discussions. What are you interested in, and what gets you more frustrated, or what pulls you back? Um, have you ever experimented with psychedelics? I feel like your mind works really well in terms of that kind of deep thinking approach.
It's something that I hope gains more traction over the next 10 years or so. There's been a source of hysteria from psychedelics, back from the 50s and 60s, where because of the political reasons, they just stopped all research on them. And to ban research on an entire category of drugs, imagine if someone was like, sorry, but there's a embargo on researching anti-inflammatories for 40 years. Like, imagine how far
Yeah.
behind the body of data would be on that. So it's great that it's making a resurgence, and that there's drug companies that are working towards creating generic versions, and there's a lot more research now headed by MAPS. There's a guy called Robin Carhart-Harris, who's a British psychiatrist who's deep into this, and there does seem to be some therapeutic potential for them in terms of long-term improvements in anxiety, depression, in insight, fear of death, permanent or 1 year lasting shifts, at least from follow-up. on state openness. So fundamental changes in your personality. So it's very cool to see that this is the way things are going. I don't think they're going to be a magic cure at the same time. I think psychedelics are very much the same as doing a compressed bout of meditation or a lot of psychotherapy or whatever, but compressed into a very short period. And that's why people can often develop HPPD, so hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or PTSD style symptoms. Because if what it does is it opens the sphincter of conscious mind to unconscious mind, and suddenly you have access to all of the stuff in your unconscious mind, and you're not ready for it, because the reason it's unconscious is that you've created defense structures around it to keep you safe. And if you're suddenly face to face with all that stuff and you're not willing to deal with it, that can be traumatic. And even when the sphincter closes again, it's like, whoa, okay, well, I feel a bit shaken what to do with all that. So I went to a Stan Groff conference. It's a breath workshop with Stan Groff, who's a psychiatrist, did a lot of research in LSD and breath work, and that was in the Isle of Man, and that was 2 days of breathing basically. And his method is supposed to induce similar psychedelic states to taking psychedelics. It worked a little bit for me. I didn't go full blown with it, but some people there were like fully embodying animals and barking and like having rebirth experiences and all this kind of stuff. But his model of this is really interesting. It talks about the conscious mind being like a sheet. And so this is the threshold of conscious mind. Everything above here is conscious. Something comes up, a piece of an emotional unit, or some blockage, or some piece of trauma or something is coming up like this, and it presses up against the sheet, and that causes discomfort because it starts to block the view. So what we tend to do is we prescribe an SSRI or an antidepressant, or some kind of anxiolytic or something, just to push it down so that we remain functional. And that has its value, particularly if it's a really big piece of trauma that's coming up and making us suicidal. But it's still there. It's just further down into conscious mind, into unconsciousness now. Whereas what a psychedelic might do is make a little incision, almost randomly, in that sheet, and the thing will come up. And then it's your job to work with that and throw it out. But the difficulty is, if it's not guided properly, it can come up halfway through the sheet. I suppose actually the perfect analogy is having a poo, because you've got this toxic stuff inside your gut that if you held onto it for weeks or months, you'd become very unwell. You'd perforate a bowel, or you'd end up with some kind of toxic blood situation. But it hurts a bit to have a poo, especially if it's backed up for a while, and you've got to stretch that sphincter and let it out. And so we can sit and hold on to it and just become more and more toxic, or you can experience the pain of letting it go. But then once it's gone, oh, what a relief. Like, that piece of toxic material inside you is now gone.
Man, that's crazy. It's very clear when you give that analogy of like when it breaks through the piece of paper, because a lot of people aren't emotionally sound enough to deal with things. And especially, it looks like that psychedelics can exasperate them. Whereas for other people, there's a high level of openness, there's a high level of emotion, and they get much more connected and have empathy and sympathy, especially on the empathy side. But especially if you don't have enough, if you're not mentally prepared to tackle it, then maybe it breaks through, and then it becomes that the reoccurring trauma from it. And it's similar, but this looks like a multiplier effect of alcohol, because all those people that have a bit too many drinks, and then they're opening up to their boyfriend and be like, oh, fuck you, and fuck you this, whatever, and it goes crazy. It's kind of like an extreme example of that. It's someone who've had a lot of trauma in their life, and then they take psychedelics and they go a bit too far from it then. And it's interesting because it's like anything, you want to be in a sound emotional state. And that's why you said something very good there about how it was guided. It's guided through a path. If you compare that to ketamine therapy in the US at the moment, or MDMA therapy as well, where they literally have a prescribed medical professional who holds your hand, like literally and metaphorically, and talks you through that process. So it looks like they are the person, they're the gatekeeper, let's say, and they're pushing it down. And when you come out of the other end of it, 4 or 5 hours, whatever, at that point, you are then able to go back into society.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. That I don't think it's a catch-all thing. I think there's still a lot of use in giving people SSRIs and anxiolytics, because there's a lot of people who the size of their trauma body is so large that it's not something, it's not really a box that you want to open up unless someone's willing to really put in the work. And as you say, a lot of the work is done in the integration phase after the psychedelic event, even if it's guided, even if it's done through assisted therapy. And I don't know much about ketamine beside the fact that it's a different mechanism of action. It's more NMDA mediated rather than serotonin mediated for the improvements in depression. But certainly something like MDMA, a lot more predictable, a lot more stable. So if you're working through something, you can go in with an intention, and that's kind of how it plays out, and then you integrate afterwards, and it allows people to talk about a traumatic event and face it without that flinch response, so that they can face it with more softness and more compassion to themselves. Something like a psychedelic, particularly things like ayahuasca and DMT, and these are wacky drugs that can be very unpredictable, like strapping yourself to the front of a rocket without a guidance system, as Sam describes it. So that's where it will show you what it thinks you should see, rather than being able to control the experience. And so as a result, that's where it's like it's something that someone who is not fully open and willing to receive whatever comes up will be traumatized by it. And so I think for most people, going through the slow approach of meditation and just dealing with the sensations as they come up in real time is probably a safer approach. And even meditation is not risk-free. You know, people act as if it's like the safest practice on earth. It's not. It's designed to undo the illusion of time and reality and self. So again, if someone's not open to that and it happens, it's very difficult to integrate that experience.
And the time and space thing there is very interesting, because when people do meditation, and I'm typically terrible at it, there's that element of your restlessness. You're sitting there and you don't know what to do, and you're trying to like relax, and you don't know, should you relax, you don't know where to put your hands. That process in itself is meant to kind of have that psychedelic effect, whereby you have that time and space element that's being taken care of. So it's something that people should be a bit more kind of cognizant of, as well as working in that area of actual improvement. But it's something that needs it's another discussion for another day, I think, going super deep on that, you know.
Yeah, there's a few analogies with training as well. It's kind of like you've got
Definitely, man.
a squat suit on. So you put on a triple ply squat suit. There's 300 kilos on the bar. You can go up and give it a go, and you might be all right. You might be able to squat it because you've got that assistance. But also, if you've not done the preparatory work, then if your technique's bad, and if you've not done a bit of training beforehand, then it's probably going to crush you. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how targeted therapies and things start to take place over the next few years. I've even seen something about psilocybin and taking out or blunting the hallucinogenic component of psilocybin, and it's still having some improvement in baseline mood and anxiety. I've no idea how that works. It shows there must be multiple mechanisms by which it works. But yeah, it's going to be a really exciting space over the next few years.
That's strange. I did not think of like how that would work when it's disconnected, but I don't know.
I'll dig up
What
the paper for you.
do definitely. Last thing I want to say on this before we wrap up is one of the things I heard when I started therapy was, it was like therapy is what you make of it. So like, as you said there, the post, I don't know, session, what your implementation, that is what's important. It's fine to get in and talk about your problems, whatever, but if you're willing to put in that groundwork to be openness in the sessions, and then practical in your application, and then to do an honest review, which is what I kind of struggle with the most. Is doing that honest feedback of this is what I'm working on, this is what I'm doing better. Um, that is the ultimate test of progress. I would say from therapy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's, to use the training analogy, you've got a barbell. It's up to you what you do with it. You can use it as an ornament, or you can get massive with it. But it's down to what you do with it, and it's kind of like talking to a mirror with
Yeah.
therapy. Like, you've got to bring the energy.
Yeah, and it's funny because the therapist won't even tell you what to do. They'll just kind of open your mind up to different. That's the whole point of it. Why it's so great, you know. Yusuf, I'd say a massive thank you, man. I really, really appreciate it. I'd love to have you back on the show, of course, whenever.
I'd love to, man.
There's,
It's been an
there's
absolute
always
pleasure.
there's always more to get into. As you can probably hear, my fire alarm is going off in the
Oh
back.
no,
Yeah, but it's all right. I mean, I put myself on mute for the last 10 minutes,
you
but
handled that like a pro.
yeah, I just had to just throw it on. I don't know if you can hear that badly, but I want to say a massive thank you, man. This was huge. Let's do many more in the future.
For sure. Also, we didn't, like, we kind of meandered around propane, but if anyone is interested, propanefitness.com is our fitness stuff. We cover more than just fitness, as you've probably guessed from this podcast. And also, if you are a personal trainer looking to move online or looking to improve your online income, then have a look at propane-business.com. We're on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, as the main places, and TikTok recently as well, which is a bit of a odd platform. But yeah, we'll send you some links.
Definitely, man. So I'll have all of that in the show notes, as always, and including your $7 ebook as well.